My name is Eva Hudecova, and I received my PhD in Comparative Literature from the Department of Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature at the University of Minnesota. My dissertation was on witnessing. Specifically, it was called The Witness Who May Not Have Been There, Eastern European Authors Looking Westward, and my advisor was Dr. Jochen Schulte-Sasse. How did I come to do what I'm doing? I was born in Slovakia, which at the time was Czechoslovakia, and this would have been in the mid-70s. And I lived through about 13 years of the totalitarian regime. And in that way, I could be called probably the last generation who was born under the regime, but also remembers the regime, because I certainly remember having to learn the Russian language and not really having an option on whether or not to do that, having to be a pioneer, which meant having to do various activities, marches, having to wear a particular uniform, being part of swearing-in ceremonies, singing certain songs. And just, I remember classes of history and geography that were certainly, even at that time, at least to some degree, recognized as propaganda, recognized as something that we had to do rather than something that we could think about and make decisions on. Both my parents were at different times required or requested to be members of the party, and they continually refused to throughout their professional careers. And both my parents were told that their careers would be different if they did not join. More specifically, my mom was more affected because she worked in the Slovak broadcasting system, and she was told that she would never advance beyond what she did at the time, which was in the radio, being a radio announcer, and it was not a it was a continual request and a continual demand, I should say. You need to join, and she had to continuously throughout her career refuse, and even going back earlier because of her parents and her grandparents, some of whom were Lutheran pastors. She was told that she shouldn't even bother applying to law, which is really what she wanted to study, because she would never be accepted. And I think that some of those traumas, all of them, have really marked her and have really marked the way in which she considers her life and her career as something that is a series of losses and a series of missed opportunities. So all of these things during my childhood really made a huge impression on me. We were, for instance, not allowed to listen to Western radio, watch Western television. We certainly didn't have access to any Western media, except for the fact that we lived by the Austrian border. And so if my dad got the antenna on the top of our house just right, we could get the Austrian public TV, ORF, which was pretty much the only place where my parents got their news. And in fact, the way I learned German is I would sit with them as a child, and I would continuously ask, what does this word mean? What does this other word mean? And they would answer, and after a while they got tired, and they just bought a dictionary and handed it to me and said, look it up. And that is how I learned German. So 89 hit me at age 13, and at the time I was ready to, I think I was in 7th or 8th grade, and I was ready to start high school, which I did in 1992, and I attended a high school that was in part financed by American missionaries who at the time were teaching English language in Bratislava, which is my hometown. And this was a huge deal at the time because the border had just opened 3 years before that, and they were bringing books. They were bringing a completely different culture, and kids my age were absolutely starving for that kind of information and those kinds of resources. So we had the first English language library. It was tiny, it was in a hole, but more often than not, the amount of students that was in there did not allow another person to enter because people were so excited. And of course, now with hindsight, these were books that were rejected from libraries and probably from 25-cent sales and things like that, but we were really excited about them. Old National Geographics were considered treasures, little treasures that people studied. And so throughout my studies there, I got better at my English, and I started working on my accent, which had been very strong in Slovak and then British for a little while. And then all my American instructors helped me work on my accent and work on my just English in general. And when I told them that I wanted to study literature and that I wanted to try to study abroad, they said, well, I think you're going to need a scholarship, and preferably a full one. And my parents were always supportive in all of this, except for saying, we can't afford many thousands of dollars of tuition a semester, so you better get a scholarship. So that's how I applied to about 5 different schools, and I went to the place that gave me the full ride, which was Waldorf College in Forest City, Iowa. And we always joked as students there that Forest City had no forest and it wasn't a city. But it was certainly fun to be there. I was part of the choir there, which was a great experience because it's a high quality choir. In fact, it tries to always compete with St. Olaf. And my senior year there, the choir was going to go on a tour of Austria, Germany, and the Czech Republic, and I could not let it stand that we were not going to go to Slovakia. At the time I was the alto section leader, and given that my father is a composer, I decided to work with the director of the choir, and we brought the choir to Slovakia, which was an amazing experience. My father arranged 3 different locations for the choir in Slovakia. The director of the choir gave an interview to national TV, and in the months in preparation for this tour, I taught the choir, and there were about 70 of us. I taught the choir how to sing 2 Slovak folk songs in Slovak. It was a lot of work, but a lot of the people in the choir were my friends, and they enjoyed it, and of course it was phonetic. But when we did our finale in a huge church in central Slovakia, and we sang these 2 songs conducted by my father, the audience could not believe that this was 70 Americans singing to them in Slovak. And so it was a very, very touching experience, with some people in the audience tearing up and wanting to hug these strangers who bothered to learn this small language. So that was a wonderful experience. My major was humanities at Waldorf, and my advisor, Dr. Nicholas Preuss, suggested that given my language experience, I speak 6 languages, I really should consider applying to comparative literature departments, which is what I did. And just like with my college applications, I went to the place that gave me the full ride, one of them, and that was the wonderful Cultural Studies and Comparative Literature, where I still am as a lecturer, and I teach classes on film, on TV, on new media, on philosophy, and of course on literature in an international context. through the guidance of my advisor here, and as well as other people on my committee, some of whom were from the German, Scandinavian, and Dutch, like Professor Leslie Morris, I did get more interested in psychoanalysis, on trauma theory, and did work on applying some of these theories of trauma, theories of witnessing, that frequently are only applied to works of nonfiction, to works of fiction, specifically works of fiction by Eastern European authors who do try to look westward and, if not transmit facts, transmit what it was like to live in a regime like that, what it was like to work through the traumatic years of, whether it be 1968 with the Warsaw Pact invasion or 1989, what it is like. And so facts are important, but cultural experience and cultural literacy, and most importantly, empathy. So this idea that I'm feeling something, and here are the reasons why I'm feeling these things. And I would like you, dear reader, Western or not, to understand why I feel this way and why I'm passionate about certain things, to transmit that passion. Those are the authors that are most interesting to me, and certainly Michal Hvorecký was one of them.
So you've taken your story kind of through the PhD. How can you kind of continue it through this translation project?
Sure. So this is my first big project after the dissertation. I started the project in, I believe, 2010, when I knew about Michal's work because he's been writing for years, and I just decided, okay, I need to contact him, and I need to see if he's interested in a collaboration. And at the time I had no idea whether he would be, whether he already had a translator, none of that. And I think from the first time we met, we just clicked. He's such a wonderful public speaker. He's such a caring personality, as the Germans would say, or even here. He's a Mensch. He's definitely a Mensch. And we were born the same year, which was kind of surprising and interesting to me. So we're part of the same generation. After several encounters and talks, we realized we did know people in common. And the most hilarious thing we found out that just proves how small the world is, as I mentioned, my dad is a composer, and for many years he was the leader of this brass band called Malokarpatska Kapela, or in German it would be Blaskapelle Malokarpatska, which was very popular during socialist years, and I think it recorded about 25-30 CDs. They toured. The communist regime allowed them to tour because they considered them harmless, and they considered them as a group that would promote how well we lived under socialism, because of course certain kinds of culture were supported. So anyway, I'm talking with Michal over coffee in Bratislava, and he notices my last name and he says, "Oh, Hudecova." In Slovak it's pronounced Hudecova. And he says, "Oh, are you related to Adam Hudec?" And that would be my dad's name. And I say, "Yeah, that's my father." And he says, "Well, my uncle was part of his band for many, many years." So Uncle Kamil Roško is his name. Uncle Kamil, Michal's mother's brother, was for 15 or I think 20 some years part of this 15-member group that are friends for life. I mean, they've experienced so much together, and they're still in touch. And Kamil helped raise Michal, and here we are many years later, hosting or giving an event in America. So this was quite an interesting little connection that we had. One of the things I really respect about Michal is that he cares just as passionately as I do about spreading Slovak culture and spreading just the understanding of what Central and Eastern Europe is going through, the current troubles that it has, the current challenges that it has. And we really did connect on that level. And part of that, an inextricable, essential part of that is translation, because a language spoken by 5 million people is never going to be important enough to learn by enough English speakers or German speakers. And so we, the native speakers, I feel like we have a responsibility, if we speak a world language well enough, to either interpret or translate, and that way to bring this culture into the West or into the South or into the North, wherever it might be. And through that, that's why the presentation at the Institute for Advanced Study was called a linguistic and cultural translation. Through the linguistic translation, there's a responsibility to do a cultural translation. In other words, just the words don't suffice. Things that a Slovak native speaker might immediately understand are not at all things that people from other countries would understand. And so then the question becomes, how do you translate those things? How do you make them interesting for a foreign audience, a non-Slovak speaking audience? And in fact, that's what one of the things that the presentation focused on is terms such as Vexlák, the illegal money changer, who was an 1980s figure under the repressive socialist regime that was just an enigma. No one quite knew what they were. They could change your socialist currency into Western currency or into this fictitious boni currency that was only good at these specific stores throughout the country. They were certainly not legal. They were illegal, but to some degree they were tolerated by the party. So the question becomes, when you're translating a novel, for instance, how do you footnote a term like Vexlák without being able to put a picture next to it or a movie clip? How do you make this history, this culture, come alive? So the rough draft and several edits of the whole novel have been done, and currently we have had about 6 months now of submitting the manuscript to various publishers with some interest. So far we have actually an English language magazine in Prague, published out of Prague, that's interested in publishing an excerpt from the novel. And our newest project is to give 2 chapters of the book to Michal's contacts in Germany, who then might have contacts in the US, and try it that way. And as well, one of my professors has a contact at Macmillan, and that would be our next step.
So how long was it to translate this novel?
So the rough draft took me about a year, and the way we approach it is, I'm the native speaker, so I kind of attack the Slovak and put it into the most rough English, and then chapter by chapter I would send it to Mark Lencho, who is a native English speaker but is fluent in Slovak and frequently travels there. And then he would do an edit, and then we would go back and forth like that. The rough draft took me about a year. And then I think we are about at anywhere between sixth and eighth edition of editing. And there are about 5 different people who have now read it and given us feedback. And so it took about a year, and then the editing is an ongoing process that I think is only going to stop once we find a publisher and it's actually in the press, because it's never finished. And a lot of theoreticians of translation say a project of literary translation is always incomplete.
So how did you work on this? What was it like? Was it long stints, short stints? Was there a dog involved?
I wish. Mostly over summers, because during the semester, during the school year, I do teach, and a lot of my intellectual ability to concentrate and bring across difficult ideas is gone by the time I'm done on a Friday night. So mostly during the summers. So in fact, a lot of it I did in Slovakia, sitting at my parents' dining room table, and being frustrated when some word came up and I couldn't quite figure out how to translate it. And, we're using various resources, asking my parents, asking the author. It's a book that's about a river cruise, and so there are a lot of words, and I think one of them that we talked about at the presentation is the word landlubber. Now, of course, in English, the word landlubber is usually said in a derogatory way by a sailor. So it's someone who's afraid of the water and doesn't want to sail or has never sailed in the past, etc. Now, Slovak has a term like this, but it's meant for rivers. It's not meant for saltwater, because of course Slovakia is a landlocked country. And so then how do you translate that was the question. And to be honest with you, right now I don't even remember what we ended up doing for now, but there was this ongoing month-long exchange between my parents, Michal, the author, Mark, my co-translator, Peter Copeland, my husband, where we just kept going about and kept trying to figure out what would be the best way to do this. Because one thing that I've tried to avoid, and I think my co-translator, Mark Lencho, really does agree, is we don't want the translation to be overtaken by footnotes. Because one of my pet peeves is opening a book where the actual text on the page is this much, and then a footnote takes over, or several footnotes take over the page. Sometimes it's necessary, but if there's a book that has most of that, that has that for the most part, then that turns me off. So we're trying to not overwhelm the reader as well as give information, and it's a tough balance to strike.
Must be a strange thing to fuss with one thing that long.
Sure.
Did you find yourself saying things like, "I never want to see the Danube again"? Or any river?
I wouldn't say that, because the river can't help it. I would more, it was frustrating, and certainly I did other things while having this exchange, so I wasn't just doing that exclusively, but there were times when I needed a break, and when I was quietly to myself thinking, "Oh, Michal, you had to use such good language. You had to use such advanced terminology. And now I can't just say boat and ship and be done with it. I have to actually work for this translation." The other than specifically words, the other challenge that we as translators had to rise to was the question of how do we narrate history, because it's not just a book about geography, it's also a book about history, because as you travel down the river, you travel through these different regimes and different countries and different experiences, and again, there are so many that the Slovaks would have been familiar with, and again, a Westerner or someone from Asia would certainly, unless you're really a scholar of the region, would not know about these historical events. So what is one word in the Slovak original has to become a pretty long footnote in English, and I get so excited about, oh, an American would love to hear this, and they would find this so interesting. For instance, there was one footnote about, and of course now I'm spacing on his name, the founder of Krav Maga, so the person who developed and came up with the fighting style of Krav Maga, who is, for the most part, if people know at all where he's from, they say Israel. Well, this was a Slovak. This was someone from Slovakia who had to flee during the Nazi regime, and almost died several times and had just a terrible time of being persecuted by the Nazis first. In some ways, his family also got persecuted by the communists. And so just this journey that started in Slovakia and these ideas that he had in Slovakia, again, this small country, ended up in Israel and started this thing that a lot of people know about. How do you put that into a footnote that's one sentence long? Because, again, there was, background-wise, for the Slovak, there was one sentence. And if you didn't know the name, you certainly knew Krav Maga, and you certainly knew, oh, this person grew up in this town. Oh, how interesting. Or maybe you even recognized it. But for a non-Slovak, again, how do you make it interesting? And my impulse is always to just geek out and go into it. And, oh, but they need to know this fact. Oh, and then he moved here and he read this book. And, oh, isn't this fascinating? And I want to include this image. And then, of course, someone has to stop me and say, listen, this can't become your book. This is still the translation that you're doing. So,
it strikes me that things are very much different than they would have been 20 years ago because of Wikipedia.
Oh, sure.
Because there's an easy way, and maybe even if you've got it as an ebook, a link, a direct link to those articles, and those articles can be bad, but they're usually there for anything like that.
Right.
And so they kind of do the duty of footnotes. For anybody interested enough to read the footnote, they're interested enough to click on the thing and get the Wikipedia piece.
Right, and I think that there's some of that, but I think that as a translator you can't assume that there's always going to be that impetus. It's certainly easier to glance to the bottom of the page than it is to find a device and start Googling. And the other, and I say glance to the bottom of the page because that's another thing we agreed upon. If we're going to do notes, which I think any translation needs to have at least some of, footnotes, not endnotes, because I've had experiences where just the action of constantly flipping back and forth really annoyed even avid readers, even people who really were interested. So this idea of glancing down and then at least having something, and then like you said, if I want more, there's always the internet, but at least having a piece of contextualization is so important.
Well, it sounds to me like, you know, your project is kind of mediating Slovak culture, and this translation is going to be one step in a really long life of telling people about Slovak culture.
I sure hope so.
but you know, as you tell your story at the beginning, for your first 13 years, Slovak culture was being repressed and falsified and ignored, and
Yep.
So what did you encounter? I mean, you went through 13 years of people trying to say this didn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my Irish relatives went through that in the United States, and it was totally successful.
Mm-hmm.
And so all I know about Ireland is my people came from there, but
Mm-hmm.
and every so often I notice a bit of mannerism that ties
Sure.
back. But in another country, if you're an immigrant, the dominant culture can more or less completely erase
Right.
the old culture.
Right.
But what was happening in your growing up, in your life, to hold on to Slovak culture for you?
Well, one thing that my parents always said is Slovakia is one of the few countries in Europe that was never an aggressor, ever. So we never wanted to occupy or occupied anyone. We were always occupied. And we were always part of some other conglomeration, whether it was the Austro-Hungarian Empire or then later Czechoslovakia. And I have to say, in 1918, when Czechoslovakia was started, there was a reason for it. We were both Slavic nations, and we spoke languages that were completely separate, but about 80-85% similar, and we were both very small, being born from Austria-Hungary, which at the time by a lot of intellectuals was called the dungeon of nations, because all of these different nations existed under it, and yet none of them had, other than Austrians and then later Hungarians, none of them had the rights to speak and publish their own language, the rights to learn their language, the rights to have a grammar written of the language. So once Czechoslovakia emerged, it did have kind of a liberating effect, and the idea was equality. So it went through different shapes and forms, but eventually it became a federation. So Slovakia and the Czech Republic were equal partners living in a federation, but the problem was that was only on paper. And the problem was that a lot of the intellectual activity, all of the ministries, or most of the ministries for the most part, was going on in the Czech part, and that was the part that was being industrialized more. There's a reason why in the dictionary you have the term pragocentrism, which is this idea of everything that mattered being centralized in Prague. And so, speaking of translation, Western literature, to the degree that it could be translated, was much more likely to be translated into Czech than into Slovak. And what did Slovaks do? They read it in Czech. And so one of the effects of that was this image, even in the Slovak parts, that the Czechs are more cultured. And in fact, if the Slovaks, if the Czechs really wanted to insult a Slovak, they would say, "Oh, it's a nation of shepherds. It's those backward agricultural shepherds, and we are the ones who have the culture." And so some of these things were boiling under the surface, and there was discontent on the Slovak side that in fact this equality that was on paper never really existed. Whether it was big names of musicians coming, as far as they were allowed during socialism, it was always to Prague. Authors giving readings, always in Prague. The film school, of course, the big FAMU film school that had all sorts of the Czech New Wave and all of these directors. that was in Prague. And a lot of these kinds of institutions that may even have had some talent and some interest in Slovakia were languishing because there was no funding. So, and then one of the other results as far as language goes is, since almost everything or a lot of culture was in Czech, films were subtitled in Czech, Slovaks understood and spoke Czech really well, and it wasn't a vice versa situation. So more Slovaks understood and spoke Czech than to a larger degree or a better degree than vice versa. And so then one of the things that happened is that Czech terms started to become Slovakized, and there was this almost like infiltration or infection of Slovak with Czech terms, and the way in which Czech grammar work started to be applied to Slovak grammar. And I think this is still an issue to this day, but that was for someone like my mom who taught Slovak language, not just to Slovaks, Slovak language and literature, not just to Slovaks, but also to foreigners. She taught Slovak as a foreign language for many, many years. That was a source of frustration.
So can you say a little bit about how you were raised? I mean, there was certainly something in your parents' refusal to join the Communist Party. On the other hand, any parent wants their kids to be safe.
Right.
And being safe involves playing along with the dominant culture. And in immigrant communities in Minnesota, you have people who, refuse to speak their native language because they don't want their kids to be odd.
Right.
And push very strongly toward assimilation. So how was it with your parents, and what was it like for them to kind of help you to be Slovak in this strange world?
Right. I think that they tried their best to not get me in trouble in school. So they would tell me things to not say and things to make sure to say while in school. So certainly I knew from the get-go that I should never mention in school that my grandma was listening to Radio Free Europe every morning. And in fact, she lived with us and helped raise me because she had really bad asthma and she couldn't live alone. So every morning she would put it to her ear because the socialist government was putting all sorts of noise disruptions to go along with the radio channel. And in fact, her hearing in that one ear got worse towards the end of her life because she would, in order to understand it, she would have to have it so close to her ear. So these are things that I knew. I don't even know if it was that I was explicitly told to never say, or if I just understood that this was something I shouldn't ever mention in school, as was the fact that, in addition or instead of Slovak news, we watched Austrian news. I certainly never mentioned that. Also, I had mentioned these pioneer activities and pioneer camps, which were these youth organizations that every child had to be a member of. That the idea was that eventually you became a good party member. So it was, getting you at the earliest stages to get you to internalize slogans and internalize quotes by Marx and Lenin and want to eventually become a member of the party. There were often retreats or often extracurricular activities that everyone in the class was required to do. And my parents, one of the reasons I love them dearly is they always allowed me to mysteriously fall ill when these things happened, and they gave me an excused absence. So I mean, every once in a while I had to take part in something just to make it not as obvious, but they always allowed me to not go to the pioneer camp or not go to this crazy ceremony where at 90 degrees and full sun kids had to stand in rows for hours and recite things, and if you were dehydrated, that's just too bad, and you fainted and you were not supposed to be given water because you should have stood there and you should have been strong enough to just stand there. I mean, this actually happened once, and after that it was a swearing-in ceremony for young pioneers, and when I told my mom that this had happened, she said, "Oh, you're never going to one of those again." So I think that it was a hard line for them to manage, because what we spoke about on the inside in the quote-unquote safety of our house was so different from what we tried to seem as on the outside, except for one thing, which is that despite the fact that Christianity was discouraged, I mean, there were Slovakia is a very Catholic country, and there were some horrible situations where the communists in the 50s and 60s invaded Catholic monasteries and kidnapped monks and forced them to cease to be monks, and deported them and misplaced them into other small communities and tortured them and interrogated them. By the time I was a child, it wasn't that bad, but members of the Secret Service were still monitoring, like they were on a regular basis following my mother when she was going to the broadcast building and leaving her shift from the broadcast building. Sometimes my elementary school was just above the broadcast building, and so I would walk down from school and wait for her to end her shift, and then we would go home together, and she would point out cars that were clearly following us. And in fact, one time she thinks that the Secret Service person was given the task to run her over, and the only reason they didn't was because as he got closer, and he was speeding towards us, he realized that she was with me and I was a little child, and that was one of those moments. And then he screeched and turned around and left. But that was one of those moments that I'll never forget, where my mom told me, "You were screeching and you were trying to push the car away with your hands," and I have no memory of that because the car was so close, and it was at night, and the his brights were on, and so I was blinded. And I think that because, for instance, my mom was seen on a regular basis in the Lutheran Church by Secret Service agents who would attend church services just to take down names of the people who attended. So she was clearly practicing her religion, and at the same time she was part of the National Broadcasting Service. She was considered to be a very unreliable and questionable comrade. Of course, everyone at the time was referred to as Comrade so-and-so. It was not Mr. and Mrs., it was Comrade. So it was a hard balance to strike, and I think they did try to shelter me from what the system was as well as they could. The problem was, given that I grew up in Děvín, which is, you would call it a suburb of Bratislava, but it's in German the name would be Theben, and it was I grew up in a house that my dad built that's about 5 blocks from the river Danube and from this huge castle right on the river. That area, so there's a castle, and then there's a road that goes around the castle, but on the other side of the road is the river, and of course the middle of the river was the border. So the socialist government considered that to be a dangerous place to let their citizens go. So after a while, I believe it was in the 60s, that entire boulevard where you could walk around the castle and see the river and the castle at the same time was bordered off. Barbed wire, electrified fences, soldiers patrolling with dogs and all of that. My parents would always tell me, well, you can go there because as a child you always want to go where the action is, where the most pretty things around you are, and they said you can go there, but be careful, don't touch these fences, don't try to talk to the guards, and just make sure you're safe. And it was as a child, it was a very surreal situation for me to be standing as close to the river as I was, and to be looking across just a few feet across a narrow part of the river, and to know that little piece of land, that little tongue of land over there is Austria, and what that even meant. Sometimes I saw fishermen there, and sometimes we would wave to each other, but it was like looking onto a different planet. I'm always reminded of East German writers and intellectuals when they talk about what happened after the fall of the Berlin Wall, where they say, I may as well have been on the moon. I never moved. I wasn't speaking a different language, but things suddenly, or within a year or so, became so different that I didn't recognize where I was, and I may as well have been on the moon. And that little tongue of land where fishermen would go in Austria was so unimaginable to me, what kind of life they led, what kinds of priorities they had in life, how they saw us from the other side. I always thought they must have the greatest views of this castle, and I can't see them, even though I'm right by it. It was like looking at a different planet.
Well, was the resistance, the sort of inner resistance, limited to your household? Was there a peer group? Could you trust your peer group? Were they all so halfway taken in by the young pioneers? And how was that to have friends in the situation?
That's a really good question. You always had to be careful with whom you opened up. That was definitely the case, and I think my mom especially was really good at that. But there was a peer group. There certainly was a peer group. My mom knew who the Secret Service agents were, even the ones who were trying to become her friends and endear themselves to her. And she knew who the people were who were to be trusted. And so one of the things that happened within the peer group is the spreading of materials that the socialist regime would frown upon. And it was photocopiers were either in places where you couldn't really put materials that were questionable. So a lot of it wasn't photocopied. A lot of it was copied by hand, or my mom had a typewriter and she would do 8-10 carbon copies of something and then type things up and distribute it among her friends, whether they were articles translated from the New York Times or pieces of literature by banned Russian authors like Solzhenitsyn. The thing that I have most in my mind is, because I used it most recently in class, is this menu. So this like fake menu that they came up with, my mom and her friends and her friends' friends. The thing is once it gets removed enough, you don't know who the other people are, which has a kind of safety to it. After the occupation of '68 and during the 1970s, which was a heavy crackdown on any kind of freedom post the Prague Spring invasion, there was no free speech whatsoever. And so what these friends of my mother's and their friends did is they came up with a menu. So just like a restaurant menu, except every item was somehow mocking either the Russian occupiers or the politicians from Czechoslovakia who quote-unquote invited them or tolerated them. So, and I wish I had brought it here, but in my reading literary movements class just this semester, because we were getting towards 1968, and what I did was I put it up, and then I did a translation of the different menu items, like I think there was one called Fried Brezhnev's Brain, Occupier's Borscht, things that they were both extremely witty, but at the same time extremely sad, and bitter, definitely bitter, but they allowed the people who wrote these fake menus to disseminate and connect with each other over the anger and the frustration that they had about being occupied, about not being able to do anything about it. It is this kind of, I wouldn't call it samizdat, because that would have been the Russian term for self-publishing under their system, but it was similar to that, in that these things were copies of copies, and they were ragged, and they were frequently, folded into inside pockets or put into Marx biographies as bookmarks, and hidden under double bottoms in drawers, and just quietly disseminated. So the copy that my mom gave me of this menu to use in my class is weathered and yellowed, and probably the 9th carbon copy of something someone did in their basement. And it was this kind of stuff that I think kept people, at least on some tiny little scale, like they were not the only ones, and kept them kept some hope and gave them some voice and some agency even inside this regime.
I visited some villages and small towns in Austria. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's a great sucking to the city, and
right,
loss of talent, and loss of traditional ways, and mm-hmm. and just there are jobs in these little places. But I remember someone saying, just kind of in passing, well, if you belong to one of the Vereine, you don't leave. And these little organizations, associations. And I remember walking around, and there was this building devoted to the town band. Mm-hmm. They said, well, everybody, every village has a building devoted to the town band. Mm-hmm. And the town band is a huge deal.
It is, yeah.
And I had a sense that there were all of these little organizations that had been around since before there was a Kaiser.
Right.
That were quietly holding everything together, and mm-hmm. the kind of the secret organization of mm-hmm. these places mm-hmm. was going to survive anything, you know. Right. And then other stuff came and went. Now, was it a similar thing in Slovakia?
No. And the simple reason being, I think Slovaks would have loved to have that, but the simple reason being that anything official had to have some connection to the party. And of course, the government and the party were the same thing. So where in Austria you had these Vereine, which had pretty much their freedom. They, within their bounds, they could do whatever they wanted, and they did. Under the totalitarian regime, you always, whatever it is that you founded as a group, of course there were lots and lots of hoops to jump through, but whatever it was, whether it was to study physics or to molecular biology, or something that has nothing whatsoever to do with politics, you always had to somehow give the official spiel to the party, the official justification of this is how it betters our socialist homeland. This is how it contributes to the brighter future that Marx talked about. And so people were really disheartened. They did not feel like they would, if they founded anything like that, even if it's a ski club, that they could do much. I mean, there were informal things. And then, of course, the thing that I talked about a few minutes ago, this friends of friends distributing questionable materials, that had to be kept secret. No one could know about this, because otherwise everyone would get in trouble. And just a little anecdote with my parents' generation, my mom has 2 PhDs and my dad has a master's in music, and both of them, having done completely different career tracks, had to have Russian all the way until their final degrees. Whether the government did not care whether it would contribute to your education in any way, shape, or form or not, you had to do it. And so there is a kind of hatred, especially in my parents' generation, towards the language itself. And I feel that even though I've only had 5 years of Russian, and I can, if I was dropped in Moscow somewhere, I could definitely get along, I feel I've inherited some of that hatred from them. And I know it's probably not based on anything rational, but I do not think it's a nice language. I do not think it sounds pretty.
Yeah. Well, there was this brass band, though. How did that work? I mean, did that manage to maintain itself in some ways autonomous from the state?
For the most part, yeah. Because what my dad did and still does to some degree is he really wants to make sure that Slovak folk music doesn't disappear, and that Slovak folk songs, even from the most remote regions, are written down, are remembered, have different, if there's different variations of the melody or of the lyrics, that these things get preserved. And then he had this 15-member brass band with 4 singers, and there's lots of it to be viewed on YouTube, for instance. He arranged it for this particular brass arrangement. Now, when some socialist politician looked at it, they didn't see anything threatening. There was no critique of the regime. And in fact, it might have been positive, because they were showing how rich Slovak culture is, and how the West says that we are repressive. Well, look, we allowed this band to travel to Austria and Germany and tour all over, showing everyone how rich Czechoslovak culture was at the time. So there was a kind of permission for the band to exist. Now, I have to say, this was unusual. This was, for 20-some years, probably the most well-known band of its type in the country. But even with all of that said, my dad has all sorts of stories of having applied for a visa, from having to wait for many, many months to get the visa, and then having just a few miles from where he lived on the Czechoslovakia-Austria border at the time, having spent a whole night before they were allowed to leave. And then, even worse, returning. So he has lots of stories of coming back with a bus and spending hours upon hours on the border, because the border patrol had to make sure that they weren't bringing in any contraband. And so some of the things they would do is, the little curtain rods that were in the bus were hollow, and they took apart every single curtain with every single curtain rod to look through to make sure there was nothing in there. During socialism, the detergent that people bought, that was available, was not great. So the 2 ladies, the 2 singers of the band, purchased a bunch of detergent in Austria in big boxes. All of that was ripped open and poured out by the bus in the middle of the road, just to make sure that there wasn't anything hidden in there. So even with a band like this that was promoted, and that any given week on one of the stations you could find one of their shows, one of their specials for Easter or for May Day parade, or something, even a band like this high profile, still when it came down to trusting them, was not trusted, and they were searched and they were questioned for hours.
Thank you.